hopefully some will come in who normally try to be here. Maybe they're running late for health reasons. For issues. That happens to all of us from time to time. We were a little bit late because we had to get gasoline in the car, in the truck. Now that we're completely broke, we're still happy to be here. Sundry do's in our social life is what we're covering. Page 73, I turned back the page here and made a note to myself that we had covered, I think at least 2 or 3 of these points about do's in business life. To be honest, truthful, prompt in meeting obligations. I find the temptation to elaborate too much on these points. Maybe that's missing his point, and I don't want to do that. But the topics that are raised here in the subpoints remind me of so many controversial things of our day, and the Christian answer that can be given and ought to be given. So that's why from time to time I don't get very far in a lesson, and I regret that happens. I do hope that some of our excursions, our tangents we run off into are of value, but we still want to stay with the game plan because we'd like to finish this outline in a timely fashion. And if his health permits, our brother Leroy is planning to bring us some new material, some other things he's working on at that time. So we'll try to get this done as quickly as we can and move on. But our brother Brownlow really did the church a service by presenting these very simple to-the-point points, where he says we're to be honest in our business dealings, truthful and prompt in our obligations, such as paying our bills. That's what he means, paying our taxes, our bills, that sort of thing. Well, we'll get into taxes too later as an obligation when we talk about our relationship to government. But right now we're just talking about our business life. And I guess the point we'll make by way of summation, and I probably got into this a little bit last time, is how it seems that the very idea of a business life is under attack. It's really baffling because that's how cash is generated. That's how people can have money just to live. I may not be a rich factory owner, but I'm glad somebody is because they provide the jobs. In my case, they provide the freight to move. So even though I don't own it, I'm glad they do. And we all get trickling down advantages. That Reaganomics is correct in that sense. The trickle down theory is obvious if anybody just looks at the history of the world and what's going on. So in our time, obviously for ideological reasons, there are many attacks, but there's more involved, I think, than just ideology. In other words, socialism, which is so rampant even in the West today, especially in North America. And I think it involves pure sorriness on the part of so many young people and older ones, laziness, love of ease and pleasure rather than the desire to work and to accomplish something worthwhile. That's my take on it. I may be wrong about that, but according to what they're saying, after the virus came through that was created in China, created by the Wuhan lab in China, very little doubt about that, and possibly even for nefarious reasons. If it was not a colossal accident, more than likely it wasn't, in my opinion. After that came through, we saw, a downturn in our economy. Many people were laid off, suspended from work for a while. A lot of them are not coming back, they say. It's vivid. It comes home to me. I sent in a deer head, a cape to be mounted last November, and it's still stuck in Phoenix City, they say, at the tanners because they can't find anybody to work to tan the hide. Boy, I'd like to tan some hides if I get home, but they can't find anybody to tan that hide and send it back to Tallapoosa to have the taxidermist to finish his work. Now, in my life, that's a crisis. For most of you, that probably wouldn't mean anything, but in my life, that's a crisis because I've been wanting that head on the wall for a long time, since November. What I'm saying is they're telling me this is going on everywhere. Part of the reason we're having supply chain issues too, they say, is not just because the ships were backed up and they had a ridiculous accident in the Suez Canal. Ship ran aground and held everything up and they haven't recovered. It's not that. It's Too many people are too lazy to work anymore. That's just what's going on. And as long as government takes care of us, when we don't work, we'll be that way. I guess that's a human tendency. If we're just going to live off the largesse of others, okay, I'll just sit back and enjoy myself. Drink whiskey, many in the world think, play cards and have fun. But there will be a day of reckoning, even in this world, because the funds will run out. Governments will collapse, and those economic safety nets will be gone. All right, enough on that. The business world can be good. Let me say this also. What we call the free market economy, or capitalism, the use of capital, but that's not really the most accurate way to put it. The better way to describe it is the free market economy, where people freely exchange goods. That is the most workable system of all. It's not flawless, but it's the most workable, especially when Christian values underlie as the foundation that kind of economic system. Because if my motto is to do good unto you because I want you to do good unto me, I practice the golden rule. I'll be honest and good to you in business dealings, and I'll not be unfair in the way I measure out things I sell to you. I won't cheat you, and you won't cheat me, basically. So as long as there is honesty and a kind of a decency and a morality in a culture, in a people, it's the best system in the world. It produces untold benefits. But of course, when society becomes corrupt because every individual, basically, or so many individuals are corrupt, then that system itself is challenged. I still think it's better than anything else, but it's still very much challenged and is not nearly as efficient. Nothing is. When there's corruption, when there is cheating going on, well, the economy cannot be divorced from social relationships, obviously. Talking about people exchanging things with people. That's what the economy is. One-on-one. One individual after another, and then collectively all of us together in some fashion. Anyway, would it be good in business? Any more about that particular point? Hey, come right in. If not, we'll move on to a more controversial area even than what we just noticed, and that will be at the bottom of page 73, point number 3, certain do's, certain positive things to do in our civil life. Some pundits on the radio, like Mark Levin, like to talk about the civil society. And this is kind of the idea he has in mind, and it involves culture and government, those things together, our value system, our mores, and the arrangement whereby we enforce our laws. All that's involved in the civil society. Number one, the Bible clearly says this, as hard as it is to swallow at times, depending on what government we live under, let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers. Romans 13 and verse 1. Of course, we can look at that, and it's a longer section. It goes down to at least verse 8, if not longer. It's not the only place in the Bible that discusses this, but the important point is, and the hard thing to put into practice is, we are to be subject to civil government. And we know that the higher powers here in the context does have to do with civil government. The one verse by itself might not tell you that. But of course, you just read on a few more, and you realize that that's what he has in mind by civil authority, by the powers. Verse 2, whosoever therefore resisteth the power or authority, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation or condemnation. So this is a truism. It's generally the case if there are laws, especially just laws on the book, and I resist those laws, I'm going to have to face a consequences. I may be punished, jailed, or even worse. So again, I say that's a truism, but he's reminding us of that, of how these things affect us, each of us individually. Remember, Paul was writing this in a system that we wouldn't think was ideal, the imperial Roman system. There was an emperor. He was the centralized top dog figure. He was the strong man in the government. Overall, everyone worked under him. There was corruption at the time, no doubt. In fact, you can read the historians who lived in that era, and they talk about things that went on, bribes, people who were not honest in their dealings. But Paul says that government, eventually, of course, that government would be involved in persecuting the church. Now that government had already been involved in one minor aspect, in the crucifixion of the Lord. Now that had happened before Paul wrote these words, and yet even though Rome had participated in the crucifixion of our Lord, they executed Jesus because the Jews had begged them to do so, basically, kind of cajoled them into doing it, threatened some of the lesser authorities, like Pilate, who was a Roman official. So the Roman government already had its hands stained with the blood of Christians to a degree already, and the persecution would get even worse. But Paul says, despite all that, let every soul be subject to the higher power. I guess I've used this illustration too many times, but it just readily comes to my mind. And I think in a limited way, I'm sorry. When I was in Cuba, which is a communist country, that Caribbean island, no doubt, since 1959 has been a socialist state. Communist state is Marxist. That's the official doctrine of the leaders of Cuba. And I spent time there preaching and teaching the gospel. I did not hold with them on their point of view, their basic ideology. They claim neutrality, but it's atheism. We know it's atheism. That's a euphemism for atheism when they say their government is neutral with respect to religion. You just see what they do in terms of their practice, and you understand that's atheism, official atheism. There's still a lot of holdover old Catholics there, and they didn't want to offend them too much, so they kind of watered it down, but everybody knows what's really going on. While I was there, I would rent cars and drive all over the island to go to different destinations. And they have red lights as we do, green lights and amber lights. They drive on the right side of the road. When you go down there 4 lanes, it looks like you're maybe somewhere in middle Georgia. There are places you would not realize you're even in a foreign country. And the laws applied. I realized I couldn't violate the laws. Somebody said, well, yeah, but the top guy over all those laws is Fidel Castro, and he's a rogue. Castro was a rogue, and his brother still is, but I couldn't run a red light because that was a just law, even under a communist system. Now, how can I say that? Well, even in this country, we're really challenged because we look at the rogues who are at the top in our state, this state in particular, the rogues who are now ensconced in the middle of our government and in our political parties that used to represent us as a people. And then we look at the national level and we just shake our heads. We just shake our heads wondering, how did all that happen? Well, partly because of rogues like those that run this state and a few others. That's how it happened. There is, by the way, fraud. There has been. I think, in Colorado, they just indicted a woman for tampering with the voting machines, and she won't be allowed. Well, the judge said she was arrested, I understood. So it has happened. It's not out of the question, as we have been told. It's not ridiculous to say sometimes people mess with those machines. My brother installed a number of them here. I've told you this before, and this is off the record. A couple of years ago, he was working with the state, and he had a crew of inmates from the prison system. And for some reason, those who normally put in these voting machines, the Dominion voting machines, were not able to do so. So his crew got the task. And I asked him, what did you learn, Pat, about the voting machine? He said, I learned they are connected to the internet because we did it. They are. So that's a lie to say they're not. Anyway, we know that can happen. There is fraud. And yet, even in a government like that, it would be wrong for me to go out here and flagrantly violate the laws. Even though I can't really respect some of the individuals who are lawmakers or executives who are supposed to enforce the law, or even some of the judges who are to interpret the law. But if that's the problem now, think of what Paul had to suffer with. Just think of all the tensions in his life. And yet, we are to be subject to the higher power. But now, when we read these few verses, we're breathing a different atmosphere from all that corruption and crime that I was just talking about. This has been going on a long time. Since the 40s, I think. There's a lot of evidence that one political party in particular, the left side, even back then, after during the Truman administration, was involved in vote harvesting and things of that nature. It's just been going on for decades upon decades upon decades, and we used to laugh at it, smile about they're going to get names off the tombstones. It never was funny, but we need to stop laughing. It never has been funny. So corruption's been here, but despite all of that, Paul says we are to be subject to the higher powers, and then he delineates what the tasks are of these government officials. And suddenly we realize that's not our government. Sometimes it is. Listen what he says. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Well, now, that may have been true under the Roman emperor, and generally speaking, the Roman emperor at that time. And about this time, I think it would have been Nero, or he would soon take power. A pretty bad character in history. But they normally are a terror to evil works, in other words, to criminals. Now, of course, we know that sometimes things are upside down, and the criminals get rewarded, especially if they have a certain political point of view, and the good people who have another traditionalist point of view are often persecuted. And that was true even then, but generally speaking, the ideal is this. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Verse 3. Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. Now, there are exceptions to the rules, but that's the rule. There are exceptions, of course. For he, who's the he here? What's the context? What was he talking about in verse 3? What class of men? Rulers. That's the higher powers that he tells us to be subject to. For he would be a minister or a ruler, is the minister of God to thee for good. So the ruler serves in your society to help you for good, to bring about good. In other words, he just said to punish the evil, to reward the good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he, the ruler, beareth not the sword in vain. What does in vain mean? What would it be to do something in vain? In vain.
Useless.
Without any use. Exactly. So, in other words, when Roman officials would literally wear a sword, it was not just for show, he's saying. It was not just ceremonial or an ornament. This was the real thing. It really had sharp edges, and they were trained to take it and use it. Now, what could a sword do to a person? It could hack you up pretty bad, right? It probably was designed to do what? What do you usually use a sword for? To kill people. To kill. Now, wait a minute. He bears not the sword in vain, an instrument of death, an instrument that can execute. In the context, he's talking about rewarding good people for good and punishing evil people for evil. And then he says, as an aside, an editorial remark, for he bears not the sword in vain. God allows him to carry that sword, that weapon, to be able to use it to execute those who do evil. Capital punishment is taught in Scripture. Go ahead.
That's my point.
Oh, yeah, well, it is. So Mr. Bill O'Reilly was a nut all those years. I liked a lot of the stuff he said, but people like that who are influence brokers in this country just need to sit down and start thinking more with their head screwed on straight instead of with their feelings alone. And they need to be consistent. Anyway, I don't like the idea of having for a government to kill people because too many times that's abused. That power of violence or force. With it, the philosophers just talk about force in the general sense, but it's violence. That's what it is, a threat of violence. But the force that the government bears is often abused. And they don't always punish the evil. Sometimes they punish the good. Those with whom they disagree. So force is used to continue to achieve more power. Now, was that true in Paul's day? Did that ever happen? Yes, of course. There was a lot of corruption even in the Roman government. But as a rule, the Roman soldier who would have acted, say, as a policeman in society, if he had seen someone harm a woman or a child on the streets and then run after stealing from that person, stealing the last loaf of bread an orphan child would have, the Roman soldier would be perfectly justified. It'd be a noble thing to do to chase that individual down, and if he had to confront him with force, to hack him up with his sword. He is the minister of God. In doing that, he's the minister of God. I know some of our well-meaning brethren, and I love these brethren and respect them highly. I'm not just saying that, I really do. Some of our very well-meaning brethren and very, very influential brethren in brotherhood have said, well, he's only the minister of God in the way that the Babylonians were God's minister to punish Judah, although it was never God's ideal will that the Babylonians attack Judah. He just let them do it, so Judah would be punished But God also punished Babylon. Just as today they say God's going to punish the soldier for using the sword, even though, as an aside, bad people are affected too. I just don't think that fits the context here. He's talking about an arrangement. The idea of civil government and what it consists. What are the main components of civil government? Of course, ours is much bigger than these few verses here. But in a nutshell, what would be good civil government? And he's talking about it even has the use of force when necessary to punish evil people. He's a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil.
This reminds me of maybe a discussion we've had before, but when the devil was tempting Jesus, he said, if you'll just bow down and worship me, I'll give you dominion over all these kingdoms, right? So was the devil lying when he said that he could do that, or does the devil have some control over the kingdoms of the world? And if that was true, then what's the implications for these verses here?
All right, how would we answer that question? Because it's a very good question. We need to ask it every time we discuss this, or one like it. How do we answer that question? Do the kingdoms of this world generally belong to the devil? He said they did. Of course, he's a liar. But does he ever sometimes tell the truth? Does he not use a mixture of truth and error to deceive people? Well, is it true that the kingdoms of this world belong to Satan? Well, what are the kingdoms? I think it was one politician years ago said that corporations are people too, and he was excoriated for saying that. He was a nut anyway, but he was right on that point. Go ahead.
Well, the devil's the prince of power of darkness. And God has obviously given him some leeway in ruling those that don't do well.
Right. So we can establish from that fact that the devil certainly has sway or power in the world somewhere. So the question is, Chris's question is a good one. Would it happen to be in the form of civil governments? He told Jesus, if you bow down and worship me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of this world because they've been delivered unto me. How can that be? How can you square that with Romans 13? Let me ask this question. It's a similar one, I think. For most Americans, is matrimony a good thing, or has it turned out to be a good thing for most Americans in the last generation or so? I'm not talking about previous generations that honored it. But lately, which protagonist on a television program or in a movie have you seen lately that hasn't been divorced or something horrible has happened? Every one of them. What's the problem today? Divorce and broken homes? But the home is from God. But who really rules over most homes in this country? Well, Satan, because we willingly allow that to happen. We as a people, we let that happen. So that's the point. Same is true, I think, of civil governments. Satan said the kingdoms of this world belong to him. Why? Well, the kingdoms, just like corporations are people, kingdoms are people too. And the governments of this world, governments, that's just an abstraction. There is no such thing as a government. There's just a group of people who have more force in society than the rest of the society. They have the greatest force, and the last say, by force. I know that sounds like Chairman Mao, but I think that's good political philosophy. As I've studied, I used to borrow textbooks from some of my siblings and read them from political philosophy from their classes. And that's what the experts say. Mao used to say, political power comes at the muzzle of a gun. Well, that's jaded, but in a sense, that's true. In a sense, Paul's saying a real minister of God who's a government official bears a sword. It's the same idea, I think. So he's a revenger. Now, back in chapter 12, verse 19, dearly beloved, Paul says, avenge not yourselves. In other words, don't get revenge. Somebody does you wrong. Don't get revenge. And that would be hard to avoid. Somebody hurts my child. Well, I'm going to make sure I hurt him, or her. But he says, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. So, if I give place unto wrath, who gets it? Well, it belongs to God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Somebody says, well, that's the last day on judgment. True, but that's not all that means, because we go passages like this, Romans 13. And he says that he is a revenger, he's a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So what we conclude is that God has ordained certain people, certain individuals who are recognized government officials in society, have that power of life and death, when necessary, to use that threat of force to keep an orderly society, relatively free from crime. Wherefore you must needs be subject not only for wrath. In other words, if you're not subject, you could get hacked up too or killed. You could go to jail. So that's one motivation. He's a pragmatic person. Paul's a pragmatist. You could go to jail if you don't do what I'm telling you, but that's not the reason. Not for wrath, not only for wrath, but also, what's another motive? For conscience sake. This means there's a duty involved. My conscience should be informed by the will of God, which is taught in Scripture. And Paul's one of the authors of Scripture, and he's telling us the will of God is that we obey these leaders, these civil rulers, always, under every circumstance. Are there limitations? What would Paul say? What would Peter say? What did Peter say about limitations on earthly rulers? When they tell us to do something we ought not, what could we reply?
God will obey God rather than men.
Right, so there's a higher power than the civil authority. God's the ultimate power. And God's will, well, you know, Obama wanted to know, how do you determine what God's will is? You're going to be like Abraham? When he was Senator Obama, he wrote a long piece about that where he said, you got to be careful here, because we allow people's view of what God says to influence public policy. We get in a lot of trouble. We could have people like Abraham going around saying God said to sacrifice their children, you know, thinking God talked to them. And you can't have a bunch of Abrahams running around killing their Isaacs, you know. So you can't let government be ruled by religious points of view. Is racism a sin?
Oh, yeah.
Says who? Mr. Obama. Says who? The government? Well, the government one time said it wasn't. I mean, one time it was codified in our laws, you know, segregation anyway. So says who? Well, I agree it is. In other words, hatred, prejudice against people just for their ethnicity. God made us all different ethnic groups. That's contrary to the teachings of the Bible. So we're right back to square one. There is no law apart from recognizing the basic moral principles that come from the will of God. So Obama was terribly naive about it, and he had an agenda too, as all the Marxists do, and he would be, therefore, in that count, on that point, particularly a Marxist. So, anyway, we go back to our passage, which is the opposite of Marxism, and he says, we must be subject for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, in other words, taxes and so on. Rendered, therefore, to all their dues. So, custom, tribute to whom tribute, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. All right, so we know the teaching here. We see it. And yet, what's the challenge?
That was Jesus' teaching too. I think he's
All about Caesar, rendering to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Yeah, there's a very, very good exchange when they want to know, should we pay taxes to the Roman government? Show me a coin, Jesus said. What did he do? Show me a coin. And he looked on it. What did he show them on the coin? This is just brilliant. Absolute brilliance on his part. Of course, he was the Son of God. Whose inscription is on this coin? What do they have to say? Whose inscription was on the coins? Caesar's. So if his picture's on it, whose coin is it? Who minted it? The Romans did. So Jesus, it was just a logical thing. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. His picture's on it, but render to God the things that are God's. So that's a good point. That principle is there. That's a basic principle of obedience to God and civil government.
And, and he says, he doesn't mention a specific individual. I mean, he just says, the ruler, the designated ruler. And
that's an ideal, I think.
Yeah, most people, I think most people say, well, you show deference, you show respect to the office of the president, although the man that occupies it may be.
Well, I don't see how we could say otherwise.
Yeah. So, so the concept, like you say, the concept is there. And theoretically, the president should be looking out for the interests of the people, but sometimes they're looking out for the interests of China.
Yeah. Or suppose you were Nero, you're supposed to be looking out for the interests of the people, but suppose you wanted some urban renewal projects to go through and you had resistance from the Senate to tear down parts of the slums in Rome and you wanted to rebuild there. What might you possibly do? Well, according to historians, it's very likely he was the culprit. You might allow fires to start in those zones and burn up a good portion of the city. But then the media is going to come after you and blame you for all that, unless you can divert attention. Oh, we didn't do it. Russia. I'm sorry, it's not. We did Russia. I'm sorry, I can't get that up. It was the Christians. They did it. The Christians. They did it. They set on fire. So everybody then in their minds turned against Christianity, the Romans. You Christians burned down this part of the city. That's all a lie, of course. But politicians have always acted like politicians. That's just what they do. It's in their nature. So, we're spending too much time on this point. But I do have one more thing to say. On this, we would have to argue. I don't mean to get into a theological debate, but if it were not for grace, none of us could be saved. And we know that anyway, but especially on this point. Why? In this country, well, what are the laws we violate? Well, we don't pay taxes on tea as we ought because they're just too high. So we're just not going to pay those taxes on that tea. It's just too high. No, that's not what our problem is. I hear, and I'm sure you have too, that every single day, every moment of every day, all day long, you and I violate federal laws. Now, maybe with recent Supreme Court rulings, some of those laws are null and void. They weren't laws to start. They weren't legitimate, we could say, because they didn't have the authority to do it. So you can always debate, if the law is constitutional and whether the Constitution should be our supreme guide and all that sort of stuff. But we were told every day we violated a number of regulations on the books. Just when you walk out your door, you've done something wrong. Somewhere there's an obscure statute on a book you violated. So does that mean all of us are going to be lost for violating civil law? God says we're to be subject to the higher power. Well, again, there's a lot to debate there because first you could ask, was that even a real law to start with? The EPA, in the name of slowing down climate change, has come up with all kinds of regulations and rules. That was what they said they were doing it for. Lately, the authorities said, nope, they don't have the authority to do that. Our Constitution says legislation comes from legislators, not unelected bureaucrats. That's a good sign. We'll see how far that goes. But my point is this. You'd have to be a legalist to say you do this perfectly. That's the new legalism, isn't it? Say, I cannot break any federal statute whatsoever. I cannot break that law. We've got chimney sweeps in our chimney. They are driving me crazy. Betty can't hear that high pitch, but I hear them. I don't know if I'm a superhero or what, but I hear them, and they are loud. The decibel level is unbelievable. I can't watch television because every few minutes they start chirping really loud in our fireplace. So I was going to build a fire and get them out. She looked at it. Oh, can't do that. They're a protected species. You're not allowed to burn up the little baby chimney sweeps. I mean, it's just so hard to comply with the rules because the temptation is there to do it anyway.
Don't you think there's a difference between willful and unwillful?
I would hope so, but then they say ignorance of the law is no excuse. We still go to jail.
Yeah, that's true. But as far as God is concerned, he talks about willful law, willful sin. But if there's a willful sin, there must be an unwillful sin.
How far would we go with that? And that's an amazing topic to bring up. It's really intriguing because could we say our denominational friends are okay with God even though they're not doing what he tells us to do in the Bible? The church that they have is not the correct church and so on. But they sincerely think they're doing right. They're ignorant about what's right. Well, I'm not going to say yes, that they're fine. And I'm going to say all those kinds of questions are left up to God in the end. God will do, whatever he does will be right and just. I know some of my brethren would say, you're a weasel. You're trying to weasel out of it. They would say I'm weaseling out of that. Because the Bible says God promises this, and if he promises to punish those who are wrong, he's going to punish them. No exceptions. So you're just trying to weasel out of what he said. Well, Again, I hope that's not the case. I would just think God is sovereign. He knows everything. He knows the individual life of every person and that person's circumstances. I cannot say God will extend clemency to people who have fallen short of the standard. I cannot say He will. Who am I to say God's going to, in the end, grace is going to cover it all? I can't say that. All I can say, here's what He says. Here's what He's always done. He's always been true to His word when He threatens. He's always done that. But whatever God does in the end, that's fine by me. I mean, because it will be right, whatever God does. So that's a whole new question there, I guess, but it kind of sprang off of that one. Do you have a comment?
Yeah. I mean, you have to be kind of careful about that, because then you fall into the trap of, well, we don't need to evangelize, because if we teach people the truth, then they'll be cognizant of it, and then they'll fall short.
Some have actually drawn that conclusion, and it's had practical consequences for missionaries. I mean, really, there are some who think that way, and they believe we just don't need to disturb them, leave them alone, leave them in their ignorance. And yet, what did Paul say about ignorance in the time of this ignorance? What, God used to wink at it? But is there anything different now into the gospel age, Acts 17:30 and 31? Yeah, but there's still ignorant people today.
Well, the discussion about clemency, Jesus basically said no. It said Matthew 7:21. He basically answered the question, no, there is no clemency. I mean, that's what He says. If God changes His mind, that's wonderful.
Because in Matthew 7:21 He says,
no.
It's not enough just to say, Lord, Lord. That's not enough.
And they do that.
They say, Lord, Lord.
Yeah, they do.
Well, they do other things too. In that context, they do other many wonderful works. That's not enough, He said, to do the will of the Father in heaven. But after all is said and done, whatever God does is right. So it's hard for us to fathom that. It's hard for us to deal with that because we know individuals that we love, and sometimes our family members who have gone on, and our only hope is we know that God will do right, no matter what. God will do right.
Well, two things. Acts 3:17. And now, brethren, I wot that through ignorance you did it, as did also your rulers, but those things which God had before showed by the mouth of all His prophets that Christ should suffer has been fulfilled. Repent ye therefore and be converted. So, I mean,
Why did He tell them? Why didn't He just leave them as they were?
Exactly. So that's the thing. They did it through ignorance. So, I mean, it's a two-part thing. We are supposed to go out and to tell people and educate them, and then people have to respond.
And in the sermon in Athens, Paul said, God made of one blood all the nations of the world. And he said, if haply we may seek after Him and find Him, though He be not far from every one of us. For in Him we live and move and have our being. That was true of even the Greeks. Even prior to Paul's arrival with his message from the revelation that came through the gospel, in other words, it's incumbent on everyone to seek after God. Well, how does anybody have an idea there is God? Maybe he doesn't know, or she doesn't know the Bible yet, or the gospel, the historical Jewish plan of salvation. But how about God? Knowledge of God, the Creator. They were that excuse. Paul says that, and why? On the basis of what? They could say, well, we didn't get the Bible. We have that excuse.
Did it say something about the heavens declaring His glory in that verse?
Well, in the Psalms 19, Psalm 19:1. But he said something very similar to Psalm 19:1, Romans 1:18-20. When he said that the invisible things of God, of Him, from the creation of the world are clearly seen. Now that's ironic. You clearly see invisible things being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead or Godness, quality of being deity, so that they are without excuse. The world, these things, invisible things, are clearly seen. How is it you see invisible things? You can't see the invisible things with the eye of flesh, but you can see the results. And from those, the things that have been made, God is invisible. Christ is invisible now to us. The Spirit is invisible. But God, the Father and the Son and Spirit, created this world according to the book of Genesis and sustains this world even now, upholds it by His power and keeps it active at every split second in all of history. God's keeping it going. Those things are invisible, and yet we see things that are visible, and from the things that are made, we infer God. Well, that's kind of 50-50. Maybe God, maybe not. Come right in. That's what some think. However, the truth is, we can infer God's existence from the things that are made. Now, that includes the entire universe. It includes our world, of course. It includes us. We are included in that equation. We human beings can see ourselves. I've got to be careful not to anticipate a thought for the worship hour coming up, Lord willing. But what we know is that we are without excuse to say, I don't believe in God. There is no God. Romans 1:18 and following, verse 20 particularly says that they're without excuse. Those who deny God are without excuse, because the things that are made are indirect evidence of his existence. But they're just as sure as if we could see him with our physical eyes. They are, therefore, the deductions we make based on the things that are inferences we draw based on what he's made.
I want to get this quote out that was originally what I was going to say. Ayn Rand. I like quoting Ayn Rand sometimes. For there's no way to rule innocent men. The only power any government has is the power to crack down on criminals. But when there aren't enough criminals, one makes them. One declares so many things to be a crime that it becomes impossible for men to live without breaking laws.
Was that Atlas Shrugged, or what was that from?
I think it's just a quote.
Oh,
Maybe
okay.
she did an interview, but I say that because back to your point of having all these endless little laws, and that's what men do. Men like to make. That's what the Pharisees. They like to make their little customs. They like to have their little things, right? But ultimately the point was we ought to obey God rather than man. And time after time, we're told that we ought to follow the rules of men, but it's more important to follow the rules of God. So our job here is to, live peaceably with all men and to obey the laws to the best of our ability. But ultimately, I think that, obeying every jot and tittle of, secular laws maybe isn't so important, but of paramount importance always seems to be following God's law. And so maybe we need to make sure that we separate the two. And does that sound reasonable, maybe?
Yes. What happens when a naysayer comes along and hears you say things like that is he will say, but he tells us to be compliant with civil law. Therefore, if we are to obey civil law because God said so, in effect, that's God's will that we do so. So we're right back to square one. We've got to know all these civil laws. But our brother Leroy's made a good observation. There's some things, let me point this out. The pagan was that excuse for denying God. He can say, I never saw God, but that's not an excuse. That will not be an excuse on judgment. But on Judgment Day, if the Lord says, did you know in this book, in federal statute number 500,000 or 210, column B, the section C, that it says you're not to kill chimney sweeps, or wherever it says, you're not to kill chimney sweeps. They come from Peru, they migrate here, they need to go back, leave them alone. And you didn't know that, and you built a fire and killed the chimney sweeps. Couldn't you say, Lord, you did have excuse because there was no way you could have known that? I pointed out, that they say that that laws are on federal books right now that prohibit us in terms of game laws from doing anything that would be against the law in any jurisdiction in the world. So if you catch a redfish in Delaware and it complies with Delaware law, the size limits, but not Guatemalan law, you're right back to square one. You violated the law. I don't know if they ever enforce that. Most game wardens thankfully don't know that, but it's on the books. There's so many obscure, weird, and ridiculous laws on the books. So obviously, what God expects us to do, what we possibly can know in life. Even a lawyer could not keep up with all that, and they don't. They specialize in certain narrow areas. They couldn't know it all. It's impossible. So when it comes to things like, speed limit laws and stuff like that, we can know. You don't get your license unless you look at the manual and are able to pass the test, take those practice quizzes. So obviously you've got to know certain things about speed limits and signs, the shapes of signs and stuff like that. And those are for the common safety. Anyway, they're good laws. but we've, I guess, gone far enough on that. The point is, to the best of our ability, we try to follow the laws of the land, as long as those laws do not contradict the laws of God. And if they do, then we ought to obey God rather than men. So that's the priority there. So on page 73 and page 74 of Brownlow's book, he deals with that, how earthly government is a minister of God, an avenger for wrath to him that doeth evil. If loyalty to earthly rulers necessitates disloyalty to God, then of course God must be obeyed rather than men. Acts 5:29, he quotes that famous statement from Peter and the apostles. Then he says, number 2, honor the rulers, honor the king, 1 Peter 2 and verse 17. We don't have a king here in this country. Well, we didn't in the beginning. We don't have a king. Remember to render all their dues, honor to whom to honor. Paul, we just noticed that a while ago in Romans 13:7. If it is impossible for you to respect the man, Chris, you can at least respect the office that he holds. That's true. It's true. Sometimes the office has been so sullied, it's going to need a good thorough cleaning, but we respect the office that he holds. The idea, the concept of civil government, the ideal of a good government. And it's about, the bottom line is this: good government rewards the good, punishes the wicked. That's the bottom line. That's it. Rewards the good, punishes the wicked. According to Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 8. Pay your taxes. Now you quit preaching and going to meddling. Well, the Bible says it. Pay your taxes. Tribute means direct taxes. Custom refers to tolls. When he said custom, to whom custom is due, tolls, imports, indirect taxes on goods and merchandises and so on. And of course, Jesus taught it's a Christian duty.
What page are you on?
Page 74. Page 74, point number 3. In fact, it's the last point under our dues and civil life responsibilities. I wish we'd had a chance to get into the other. We may start it, but we won't be able to finish it. The section number 4 about guarding the truth. Now, this is a really inspiring, motivating section. It's a Christian duty, he says. Bottom of page 74 in our book by Brother Brownlow. O Timothy, Paul wrote to him, guard that which is committed unto thee, turning away from the profane babblings and oppositions of the knowledge which is falsely so called. That's a very good way of describing, even in our own time, the knowledge or science falsely so called, or knowledge falsely so called. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 20. It's profane babblings and oppositions. Paul repeated the charge in his second letter to Timothy, 2 Timothy 1 verses 13 and 14. The truth, or sound words, had been, now notice this progression. First they'd been committed to Paul, and such was a sacred trust for him to guard. So then Paul had committed it to Timothy. Timothy was to commit it to other men, faithful men, who should be able to teach others also. We have been approved of God, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 2:4, to be entrusted with the gospel. This is the world's most valuable trust. Now that's pretty easy to read, kind of glib, but just stop and think about what it means for us here in this place and the work we're trying to accomplish right here in this community. We've been entrusted with the truth. So that puts upon our shoulders a really heavy weight. Now we can bear it. We can be up to the task if we, every day of our life, fully consecrate ourselves to the will of the Lord. Seek His glory above all else and the salvation of our fellow men. If that's our priority, we can bear that weight. But if we grow lax and if we become indifferent to the purpose here or the purpose of the Lord's church in general, then of course those things won't be accomplished. So this is, to me, it's motivating to say we're told we are to guard the truth. We have been entrusted with the truth. So we are responsible for it. Well, that's a big responsibility to put that on the Church of Christ. Hey, there are a lot of really intelligent people in Washington, and they've got more resources. I mean, look at the trillions the federal government can just print up if it needs. So why don't we put it on their shoulders? They can bear it much better than can we. Well, it's not God's plan, is it, for how to reach the world? We might think that would be the most efficient way to do it, a strong centralized government with tentacles through every aspect of society can get the word out. That's not the way God said to do it. It falls on local assemblies, churches, local churches, just like this one. That's God's plan. So it's got to be better. By definition, it's got to be better. And if we say, well, it's not very efficient in our day, is something wrong with the plan? No, No. Something would be wrong with those of us who are entrusted with that plan and with that knowledge of the truth. Number 2, the gospel truth must be protected from false teaching and its teachers. This is vitally important in our time. False teaching. False teaching, he says, top of page 75, is but one gospel. Or Paul teaches that, there is but one. So Paul's an exclusivist. There's just one gospel, just one truth, and everything that differs is ruled out by definition. There are some who would pervert the gospel of Christ. They would present a substitute gospel, a counterfeit gospel. Counterfeits look like what? If they're good counterfeits, what do they look like?
Real thing.
The real thing. And that's the insidious nature of a good counterfeit. So there are good counterfeit gospels. They look like the real thing, but they're not. How can you tell the difference? Well, there's a standard. In terms of our currency, our money, how do you know when it's counterfeit? Well, some of us can't tell too easily, but there are trained eyes who can do so. People who work in banks often are very good at it, and merchants who see the bills every day coming over their counter. How do you determine that? I was told, I don't know if this is true, that I think for Secret Service agents to learn how to detect counterfeit bills, they spent like 3 months in intensive training studying real bills, the authentic money. And we're never allowed to look at the first counterfeit. But they memorized every single detail, every minute detail of the bills that were legitimate. Why would they train them to do that? Because just as soon as they saw a counterfeit, they recognized it. Well, if that's true, that's a good illustration of how we are to recognize error when we're taught the truth and we understand what the truth is. We may not have studied all these false doctrines. You never could in a lifetime because too many different denominations are popping up all along with new ideas. So it'd be hard to stay up on all the literature. You couldn't do it in one lifetime. But you can know what the Bible says. And so if you encounter one of those groups, one of those people, then you see the difference. You see the counterfeit for what it is.
Several years ago at the open forum at Freed Hardeman Lectureship, there was a big discussion about preachers were spending too much time with denominational writers and reading books of error and things. Well, those in defense of it were standing up and saying, well, I study those so I know what they teach, and if I hear them teach, and I know it. Brother Don McWhorter stood up finally and said, fellas, I don't have time to read all the books about all the denominations. But he said, if I know what the Bible teaches, then I'm quick to recognize something that's not in the Scripture.
Right.
And so that's how you spend your time.
Well, I think those are words of wisdom on Brother McWhorter's part. And I would agree, that's that same principle if it's true about how they train agents to recognize counterfeit bills. And it makes sense. Makes sense.
It reminds me of that, I guess, a book where I've heard that before. 1 Corinthians 14:8, for the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself for the battle. So I think that idea of an uncertain...
Our brethren used to use that. He talked about the Freed Hardeman lectures. We used to go, and our brethren would warn in those lectureship series about men in the brotherhood who are preaching with an uncertain sound, that phraseology. And there was a reason for that. I made this quick note, and then we'll dismiss this class. My question is, why is doctrine important? Well, doctrine equals, or is, teaching. It's just a synonym for teaching. Teaching is the teaching of ideas. Ideas lead to action. Ideas have consequences. Action continued leads to character. So ideas are from God's will. And this equals how we can say, Jesus is my Lord. Now, is that true or is that a stretch there? Is that true to say those things? Doctrine is teaching. Teaching would be ideas. Ideas lead to action. Action solidifies into character. Ideas are from God's will. This is how we can say Jesus is Lord of my life. Many will say that, but in practical terms, they're not demonstrating true submission to Jesus. It's just the Jesus concept, and it's their own concept. And this is what I think Jesus is like, and this is what he wants me to be, or to do, or think. Well, that's subjectivism, and every man becomes a law unto himself. But if I know what Jesus, how do I know what Jesus says? What Jesus wants, so he can be Lord of my life? Jesse, how do I know what Jesus wants right now?
It's written down for us.
Where?
His inspired word.
Exactly. So we all know the answer to that one. We all know, but these are the problems we face in the brotherhood, where there's a laxity on the part of some, tendency to want to be trendy and go along with new ideas that are congenial to the way the world is thinking at the moment. It won't create any waves, and that is a minimizing of doctrine. Well, I guess we need to stop here on this point. We'll try to cover this next time. I'm going to be quiet. I believe that they're coming out now, but thank